Good morning, everyone. We're going to get going with today's webinar. Welcome, and by way of introduction, my name is Ross Dixon and I'm a Senior Manager here at RSM Australia in our Albury office. I'd like to welcome you to our New South Wales COVID-19 Business Grants and Employer webinar, presented in partnership with Business New South Wales and the Australian Business Lawyers and Advisors. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Following on from the public health order that was implemented on Saturday, which has resulted in a statewide lockdown, there's been some confusion around how businesses across regional New South Wales can access the economic stimulus packages. These packages obviously were designed to support businesses and keep people in jobs. Since launching this webinar on Wednesday, we've received an unprecedented response, and we're delighted to welcome so many of you to this webinar, with 120 in the room already and 200 plus signed up to listen in. Just to give you the context, after the webinar finishes, we'll be sharing our slides and the recording with the people who signed up initially. This is going to be the first in a series of webinars which is designed to support businesses across regional New South Wales through these challenging times. As an organisation in RSM, we note the confusion around what supports are currently available at a state and federal level, as well as acknowledging the huge complexity in regards to those employer obligations. Today's speakers are Travis Connell, who's a principal at RSM here in Albury, Anthony McFarlane, the Regional Manager for Murray Riverina Business New South Wales, Dean Tyler, Senior Associate, Australian Business Lawyers and Advisors, and I'm pleased to announce that shortly we will have an opening address in regards to these matters from the Honourable Damien Tudhope, who is the Small Business and Finance Minister for New South Wales. Before I start, I'd like to outline the format of today's presentation, which will involve each of the speakers speaking for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a Q&A at the end. You'll see on your Zoom call that there is a Q&A box. We'd ask you to put any questions in there. The Q&A will kind of be answered towards the end of the webinar. And obviously the Q&A can only be seen by the panelists today, whereas the chat box everyone can see. But we'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can today, but we're mindful that all the information that we provide is general in nature and that we should refer to obviously the Service New South Wales website, give Service New South Wales a call or reach out to your advisor should you have any further questions. I'll now pass to Anthony McFarlane from Regional Business New South Wales, who's going to introduce our special guest.
Thanks, Ross, and thank you to RSM Australia for helping to put on this webinar at such short notice. As Ross said, my name is Anthony McFarlane and I'm Regional Manager for Business New South Wales, looking after the Murray Riverina. And for anyone not familiar with our organisation, we were formerly called the New South Wales Business Chamber, but we are the peak advocacy body for businesses in New South Wales. And it would be fair to say that when we got the news Saturday afternoon that we were going to be going into lockdown, we've been actively assisting business owners this week in helping them understand their obligations at this time. Business New South Wales also provides a range of commercial services, and as Ross mentioned, we'll be hearing from Dean Tyler from Australian Business Lawyers just on some of the employer obligations that businesses out there are now having to face in this brave new COVID world. But to our special guest speaker who has come on board at short notice, I would like to welcome Minister Damien Tudhope. We all know you are a busy man, and on behalf of all the businesses and local chambers that are on the call, thank you. And Damien is the Minister for Finance and Small Business. Before going into politics, he was a small business owner of 30 years, so he understands the pressures on business owners, especially in terms of maintaining cash flow. Damien has a soft spot for regional New South Wales, having come from the Southern Highlands, and he has also been down in the Murray Riverina a number of times this year to be with businesses. So the New South Wales government have done a tremendous job in the space of about 7 weeks when the federal government didn't stand up JobKeeper again in standing up JobSaver, which as of today's date has now processed has had 2.3 billion in applications and processed about 1.7 billion in grant funding. But I'll hand over to Damien now, and thank you for joining us, Minister.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks everyone. I hope I'm on speaking. I always forget to take myself off mute when I start these seminars. It's not a thing where you say it's a pleasure to be with you. I'd rather not be with you today talking about businesses which have been shut down or had their trading restricted as a result of public health orders. Government shouldn't be interfering with business life to the extent which they have been, and it's always difficult in the circumstances to have to come and talk to businesses who are undergoing a significant amount of stress because the government has issued an order which has impacted on their trading and their supply in circumstances where they will have difficulty paying their rent, their suppliers and their bank and the like. And there are always circumstances where businesses and business owners are under significant stress. In those circumstances, the government is under significant obligation to assist businesses who are the subject of public health orders. Obviously, to date, a great deal of the assistance has gone to greater metropolitan businesses because the orders which have been made to date have impacted greater metropolitan regions rather than regional New South Wales. It's only last week that because of the expansion of the virus into regional areas, that the whole of New South Wales became subject to public health orders, and the immediate impact on regional areas was ramped up. To that end, there will be lots of regional areas who wouldn't be aware of all the grants which are available. And the first place to go, of course, is to Service New South Wales to ascertain what grants might be available. And in summary, the current grants which are available are JobSaver grant, which is a grant available to businesses earning who have an annual turnover of over 75,000 up to 250 million, and that includes non-employing businesses, but which have had a decline in revenue of more than 30%. So that the amount payable to those businesses is equivalent to 40% of their payroll. However, for non-employing businesses, it's a flat amount of $1,000 per week. The second category of grant is what we call micro business grants, which are for businesses between who have an annual turnover between $30,000 and $75,000 dollars per annum, and those businesses can receive up to $1,500 per fortnight, and those micro business grants operate from the beginning of the impacted period. Now, I'll just say one thing in relation to some confusion which has existed in relation to the grants. There are regional businesses who are saying, why aren't we qualifying for the COVID-19 business grants? And you may recall, or some may recall, that we put in place business grants for the period commencing, I think, 19th of July, and that was for a 3-week period, and businesses could apply for $7,500, $10,500 or $15,000, depending upon the amount of the impact on their business. Some regional businesses are saying, why are we precluded from applying for those grants? Well, those grants were available in that period when the JobSaver payments weren't available. So the New South Wales government said we had to make provision because we hadn't been able to stand up the JobSaver payments. So this was the first 3 weeks of the lockdown period in Greater Metropolitan Sydney, where we needed to get money into those businesses. The way that we now get money into the businesses is the JobSaver program and the micro business program. So there are some out in the media saying that we're not assisting regional businesses because those initial grants aren't available to regional businesses. They were available to impacted regional businesses, and there may be some regional businesses in the accommodation sector and others who could demonstrate the 30% impact and would have qualified for those original business grants. There are other, obviously, mechanisms which the government has put in place, and they're things like payroll tax deferrals and payroll tax concessions. We've also, as some would now be aware, we started in relation to rental, a program to prevent evictions without mediation. We've in fact now adopted the National Code again, which requires landlords of impacted businesses to provide waivers and deferrals of rent as part of the arrangement between the landlord and tenant in respect of impacted businesses. For some who might be on this call, there are gaming machine tax deferrals. We've expanded the business advisory service, which is available through Service New South Wales and through the Small Business Commissioner. We've had a special accommodation package which will go live in September in respect of numbers of nights lost, in respect of rooms lost for accommodation providers, and that's a special package for those accommodation providers. For individuals, of course, there is an opportunity for people who have lost income hours, and that's an individual who has potentially either been stood down or lost hours of employment, where they have an opportunity of applying for a COVID disaster payment from the Commonwealth Government. Now, I want to just stress this. Businesses, if they are impacted, should go to the Service New South Wales site, whereas those who are impacted those who are impacted personally, an individual, should in fact go to the Service New South Wales /business site, and they can track the opportunities for getting grants. One further thing that I'll just say is that there has been some criticism of Service New South Wales because of the delay in applications and getting money into people's accounts. I want to say I will partner with anyone who wants to make that criticism, because Service New South Wales were rightly criticised for those delays. However, I do say that enormous steps have been taken to rectify that situation, and there are a number of levels of complaint. First of all, there was a delay in processing the applications. Secondly, there was a problem in getting calls back, and people were complaining that they were waiting up to 4 hours on the phone to speak to an advisor in respect of getting advice about what they could or could not apply for. I can tell you that we've now got that down from 4 hours, and I think it was 17 minutes, the longest time that people were waiting on yesterday in respect of follow-up calls in respect of applications. We've employed 530 odd new people to assist with Service New South Wales. So there was a lot done to, in fact, increase that process. And what I can say now that the time for the processing of an application to its approval is 7.5 days. So from the date you lodge your application to the date on which it will be processed is, at the moment, the time tracking is 7.5 days. I, in fact, think that's too long. I would like to think that we're going to get that down further. And as of course, we clear the backlog, I'm confident that we will get that down further. I'll leave you with these last two things. The importance of getting advice in the current climate, I just can't highlight enough. We are well served in New South Wales by a very competent Small Business Commissioner who is readily available to provide advice, but it also has a very up-to-date website with explanations and opportunities in terms of getting assistance in relation to services which might be available. So getting that advice either from your own personal advisors or from Business Connect or from the Small Business Commissioner, I couldn't encourage people more. But secondly, and the last thing I would say is that the business community have a role in assisting the government to get the message out about the importance of vaccinations. And I welcome the discussion that employer lawyers are going to have this morning about, or today, about the opportunities for employers to engage in providing advice about the circumstances in which they can request their employees be vaccinated. The government, of course, announced just today that there will be circumstances in the health industry where people working in the disability sector will be required to be vaccinated as part of working in that sector. Now, currently, the New South Wales government can only pass laws relating to the public sector employees. We have no jurisdiction over the private sector employees. That's a fair work issue, and the Commonwealth government would need to address that. So that's a welcome discussion to have, but the really first and foremost policy position of the government is we want more and more people in this state to be vaccinated, because vaccination is the pathway to increasing liberties for us all. So I encourage you all to be involved in that process. Just if I could make a fleeting observation in relation to LGAs. One of the concerns that I hear from Regional New South Wales is that there are LGAs in the regions where there are no cases, and maybe LGAs is not the real test of whether there ought to be restrictions or otherwise, or freedoms applicable to a particular area, and maybe a better test is potentially identifying regions. I think that's a debate and discussion worth having, because it maybe is a better test for making sure that we are properly targeting areas of concern, rather than having LGAs impacted in circumstances where there are no cases and locking up those LGAs for what appears to be no apparent reason. There needs to be work, and this is a never-ending problem for border areas, is the relationship between Victoria and New South Wales. There are ongoing discussions, and they are ongoing in relation to the relationship between how we free up those cross-border arrangements. And again, if we were moving towards regions which had no cases, that might be a good argument to be able to raise with our Victorian counterparts. Thanks for having me today. You'll appreciate that I have a reasonably busy schedule on at the moment. I've got Benny Kang on this call. If there are issues which you want to raise with my office or me, Benny will remain on the call after I get off. And if there is issues which you'd like to take up with my office, he will be more than happy to take up that issue and revert to anyone who has a specific question that they need answered. So Anthony, thanks for having me. Ross, thanks for putting this webinar on. I think it's an enormously valuable contribution.
Thank you, Minister. And thanks for taking the time to be with us. I know you've got to run off to another meeting. You know, any certainty the government can provide in terms of opening up regional New South Wales and allowing business owners to plan for that is welcomed. And, you know, outside the box thinking on opening up LGAs that don't have cases or regions, that's certainly great to hear.
You know, thanks, Anthony.
Thanks. I'll hand over to Ross.
Thanks, Anthony, and thank you there to the Minister for his insights. So our first speaker today, obviously, the Minister gave us some great detail around what kind of schemes are available. And our first speaker, Travis Connell, who's a principal from RSM here in Albury, is going to discuss what those eligibility criteria look like and the machinations for getting that support. Travis has over 13 years of experience in accounting in not only the local Albury area, but across the Riverina. And he is responsible for offering a wide range of solutions, working with a wide range of industries, including construction, transport, retail, and earth moving. I'll now pass you over to Travis.
Thanks, Ross. Hello and welcome. My name is Travis Connell and I'm a principal at RSM Australia within our Albury office. RSM is a global leader for your audit, tax and consulting needs with over 99 years experience. RSM in Albury are just one of our many locations around Australia. RSM is dedicated to proactively assisting and supporting businesses within the region. This encompasses today's presentation, which will focus on the current grant support being provided by the New South Wales State Government.
Travis, apologies, we're just having some feedback on your presentation. Abby's going to pop in and help you with that, and I'm just going to talk to your script for now, if that's okay. So, apologies for that. So, if we look in terms of the overview of the grants of the supports provided, what Travis was planning to talk to is obviously the COVID-19 business grant, which the Minister had spoken to, JobSaver, the 2021 COVID micro business grant, and the payroll tax support. So as we work towards that, so in first things first, the 2021 business grant is a one-off grant provided for cash flow support for businesses impacted by the first 3 weeks of the Greater Sydney lockdown. The grants vary in value from $7,500 to $15,000 for eligible businesses, and each eligible business can apply for 1 grant per ABN. I think Travis is, I think you're back.
Have you got me here, Ross?
Yeah, that's perfect, loud and clear.
Thanks for that. Sorry, technology is always wonderful in these working from home times. So thanks for your understanding, everyone. Obviously, the eligibility requirements for any business wishing to apply for the 2021 COVID business grant are as follows. So businesses are required to have an ABN and be operating in New South Wales on 1 June 2021. This is an important item for border businesses who may conduct businesses in both states. Have had an annual wages of 10 million or less on 1 July 2020, have aggregated turnover between 75 and 50 million for the year ended 30 June 2020. Have business costs for which there are no government support available, have experienced a decline in turnover of 30% or more, and we'll go into more detail on that in a minute. For employing businesses, they need to maintain their employee headcount from the 13th of July 2021 while they continue to receive payments under this grant and the JobSaver scheme. For non-employing businesses, the business receiving payments must be the primary income source for the associated person. Next slide, thanks, Ross. Businesses must have experienced a decline in turnover of 30% or more due to the public health order over a minimum 2-week period from the 26th of June 2021 to the 17th of July 2020, compared to the same period in 2019 or the same period in 2020, or a 2-week period immediately before the Greater Sydney lockdown commenced, being the 12th to the 25th of June 2021. A different comparison period may be used for businesses on the Victorian border impacted by the Victorian stay-at-home directions that commenced on the 27th of May 2021. To determine your business's decline in turnover, the accounting method being either cash or accrual will need to be on the same basis as the business's business activity statements are lodged. Southern border businesses impacted by the Victorian stay-at-home directions that commenced on the 27th of May 2021 must have experienced a decline in turnover of 30% or more over a minimum 2-week period from the 27th of May all the way through to the 17th of July, compared to the same period in 19, 20, or the 2-week period just before the Victorian stay-at-home directions, which commenced between the 13th of May and the 26th of May 2021. This means that Southern border businesses' eligibility period is further expanded compared to the rest of New South Wales due to the impact of the Victorian stay-at-home directions have had on those regions. Southern border businesses are businesses that have an ABN registered in or are physically located and primarily operate in local government areas listed by Service New South Wales. An example of this is Albury Federation or Greater Hume Shire. If you think you fall into this category, please review the extensive list of local government areas which are listed on the Service New South Wales website. As mentioned, there are 3 tiers of grants available depending on your business's decline in turnover. Tier 1, businesses that have experienced a decline in turnover of between 30% to 49% will be eligible for a grant of $7,500. Tier 2, businesses that have experienced a decline in turnover of between 50 and 69% will be eligible for a grant of $10,500, and businesses that have experienced a decline in turnover of 70% or more will be eligible for a grant of $15,000. Applications are now open and close on the 13th of September 2021. Businesses can apply for the grant directly via the Service New South Wales website. Businesses not on the highly impacted list must submit evidence that you experienced the relevant decline in turnover due to the public health order in the specified period in the form of a letter, which can be completed by a qualified accountant, tax agent, or BAS agent. The website has been updating the highly impacted list over the last period of time, and you should review this when completing your application. Businesses are required to declare that their employee headcount on the 13th of July, if applicable. If you have employees, you will need to declare that you will maintain your employee headcount as at the 13th of July for the period for which the business is receiving payments under this grant and the JobKeeper scheme, and also notify Service New South Wales if the employee headcount declines over the period of the payment due to any actions of the business. Businesses must also submit an income tax return or a business activity statement with the application to demonstrate the aggregated turnover. We'll now move on to the second grant, which is the JobSaver payment. JobSaver will provide cash flow support to impacted businesses to help them maintain their New South Wales employee headcount from the 13th of July 2021. Eligible businesses will receive fortnightly payments covering the period from the 18th of July onwards. Eligible businesses with employees will receive the equivalent of 40% of the weekly payroll for work performed in New South Wales, with the minimum payment being $1,500 per week and the maximum being up to $100,000 per week. Eligible businesses that do not have any employees will still receive $1,000 per week if they do meet this eligibility criteria. To be eligible, businesses must have an ABN and be operating in New South Wales on the 1st of June 2021. Businesses must have an aggregated annual turnover of between $75,000 and $250 million for the year ended 30 June 2020. For employing businesses, they must maintain their employee headcount from the 13th of July 2021 while they continue to receive JobSaver payments. For non-employing businesses, such as sole trader businesses, the business receiving the payments must be the primary income source for that associated person, and the business must have had a decline in turnover of 30% or more due to the Greater Sydney lockdowns, which I'll discuss in more detail now. To be eligible for JobSaver, the business must have had a decline in turnover of 30% or more due to the public health order over a minimum 2-week period within the Greater Sydney lockdown, which commenced on the 26th of June and due to end at 28th of August 2021, compared to the same period in 2019, the same period in 2020, or the 2-week period immediately before the lockdown commenced, being the 12th to the 25th of June 2021. Alternate decline in turnover tests are available and can apply for businesses that started after June 2019 or that have been impacted by acquisition, disposal, restructure, or natural disasters. To determine whether your business's decline in turnover has declined, the accounting method being either cash or accrual will need to be on the same basis as the business activity statements are lodged on. This slide details further eligibility criteria or questions businesses may have. Employees can receive the Commonwealth COVID-19 disaster payments if their employee is receiving JobSaver, and I think Dean Tyler is going to talk about that shortly. Also, non-employing businesses are not eligible for the JobSaver payment if individuals associated and deriving income from the business have received the Commonwealth COVID-19 disaster payment since the 18th of July 2021. This means non-employing businesses should consider which grant is appropriate for their business. Employee headcount relates to the number of persons who are employed in New South Wales who are permanent, full-time or part-time, or casual staff that have been employed by the business for more than 12 months, and businesses are required to maintain their employee headcount. Businesses will remain eligible if their employee headcount declines for reasons outside control of the employer. For example, if an employee voluntarily resigns. Weekly payroll is calculated by taking the most recent activity statement lodged with the ATO prior to the 26th of June 2020 for the 2021 financial year. Item W1 in the business activity statement includes amounts of wages, salaries, and other payments that are subject to PAYG withholding tax. You are required to divide W1 amount by the number of calendar days in the month or quarter, and then multiply that figure by 7. Businesses that operate in other states and territories should use the same approach as above, but only include wages paid to employees who usually work or are based in New South Wales in the activity statement period. Applications are now open and close on the 18th of October 2021. Businesses can apply for the grant directly with Service New South Wales via the website. On successful application, businesses will receive automatic fortnightly payments with no need to reapply for each new payment. Payments are made in arrears and the first payment backdated to the 18th of July 2021. Businesses who are not on the highly impacted list must submit a letter from their accountant confirming they have had a decline in turnover. Businesses must declare their employee headcount on the 13th of July 2021. Businesses must maintain their employee headcount from the 13th of July whilst continuing to receive JobSaver payments. Businesses must also submit an income tax return or business activity statement with the application, and they also must submit evidence on how weekly payroll amount was calculated. The next grant which we'll talk about is the 2021 COVID-19 Micro Business Grant, which will provide fortnightly cash flow support to impacted micro businesses. Eligible businesses will receive fortnightly payments covering the period from the 26th of June onwards until the New South Wales lockdowns are lifted. Eligible businesses will receive $1,500 per fortnight. To be eligible, you must have an ABN and be operating in New South Wales from the 1st of June 2021. Businesses must have an aggregated turnover of between $30,000 and $75,000 for the year ended 30 June 2020. The business must have expenses no other government grant covers. For employing businesses, they must maintain their employee headcount from the 13th of July while they continue to receive payments under this grant and the JobKeeper scheme. For non-employing businesses, the business receiving payments must be the primary income source for the associated person, and the business must have had a decline in turnover of 30% or more due to the Greater Sydney lockdowns, which will now be reviewed in more detail. To be eligible for the 2021 COVID Micro Business Grant, the business must have had a decline in turnover of 30% or more due to the public order, health order over a minimum 2-week period within the Greater Sydney lockdown, compared to the same period in 2019 or 20, or a 2-week period immediately before the lockdown commenced, being the 12th to the 25th of June 2021. Alternate decline in turnover tests are available and can be applied for businesses that started after June 2019 or have been impacted by acquisitions, disposal, restructure, or a natural disaster. Applications are now open and close on the 18th of October 2021. Businesses can apply for the grant directly with Service New South Wales on the website. On successful application, businesses will receive automatic fortnightly payments with no need to reapply for each new payment. Payments will be made in arrears and the first payment will be backdated to the 26th of June 2021. Businesses must declare their employee headcount on the 13th of July 2021, and businesses must submit a tax return, BAS, or other supporting turnover evidence with the application. The last thing I'd like to touch on is the New South Wales payroll tax relief. New South Wales payroll tax lodgement due dates have been deferred to the 7th of October 2021 for your 2021 annual payroll tax reconciliation, your July and August monthly lodgements. The New South Wales government has recently announced a 25% reduction of payroll tax for the 2022 financial year for eligible businesses that have less than $10 million in total Australian wages and experience a 30% decline in turnover. Further information will be available when applications for the payroll tax reduction open in late August 2021. We could obviously talk to this information we have gone through for more than the time we've been allotted. However, I hope there was enough information to give you an overview of what government support is available to you and your business in these challenging times. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, Travis. Really good insight there. And obviously, as Travis has said, we appreciate it's fairly complex. So we're starting to see a few questions come through on the chat and the Q&A. So please continue to do that. Our next speaker this morning is Anthony McFarlane, who is the Regional Manager for Business New South Wales in the Murray arena. Anthony is an experienced policy advisor and commercial lawyer with a demonstrated history of working in commercial transactions for government and corporate clients. Anthony.
Thanks, Ross. And that was a great presentation, Travis, and I hope it was helpful for all out there. You certainly will get in the Q&A to some questions around new businesses and also some of those particular questions around reducing head count will be covered by Dean in his next presentation. But I think Travis's presentation was timely because at Business New South Wales, we know that cash is critical at this time, especially if you're one of those retail businesses that has been forced to close in regional New South Wales since Saturday. When we took a barometer of how businesses were travelling in July, our lockdown impact survey showed that businesses were more vulnerable going into this lockdown than when we took that survey in March 2020. One of those measures that was of concern was liquidity or cash reserves. One in five businesses this time told us that they only had 5 weeks of cash reserves if they were closed down before they were going to run out. Compare that to a year ago when the average was 6.5 months of cash reserves. We also saw in that survey that in the Murray Riverina, that revenue expectations before this latest lockdown were already down by something in the order of 38%. So, we certainly, thought today's webinar was important in supporting you in accessing financial assistance if you have been impacted by these restrictions through no fault of your own. Our next speaker, Dean Tyler, who is an employment lawyer with Australian business lawyers and advisors, has been helping our members and businesses across New South Wales grapple with employer obligations in these uncertain times. And you might have might remember that the minister spoke about the vaccination rollout and what the government is saying in terms of especially for Greater Sydney in terms of a relaxation of freedoms. 70% double vax is where they are going to be measuring where when they can relax those some of the restrictions. But Dean, who has been with our workplace advice line and then Australian business lawyers for nearly 10 years, just knows some of the pressures on business, and he's been advising businesses on this issue of vaccinations in the workplace, and how businesses are able to reduce headcount, not having JobKeeper, industrial relation flexibilities, and also just looking at implications for employers under the public health order. And in regional New South Wales, we've had to grapple with that quite quickly when the media announcement was made on Saturday afternoon quite abruptly. So I'm going to hand over now to Dean to talk us through some of those issues, and I hope you gain some valuable insights out of that. And Dean is certainly well placed to be commenting today. So thanks for joining us, Dean.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you for having me, everyone. Anthony, you said that I've been helping businesses grapple with the issues that are coming up, and grapple, I think, is a pretty good term, because the complexity of this and how fast it changes is really something that keeps me on my toes. I mean, I'm coming to you from Sydney, which not an hour and a half ago was announced that our lockdown is going to go to the end of September now. That's how quickly things can change. And obviously everyone in the region's found out the hard way last week when it was announced, your snap lockdown was announced with almost no notice. So I think we're all sort of living through a similar experience, and we know how quickly things change. I think what I want to say first up is, this is a very difficult area, and I could probably talk for days on it, but I've only got about 10 minutes. So I just want to go over some things fairly quickly. The sort of first thing I'll say, though, is what I've found out in the last 12 to 18 months since the pandemic has kicked off, and I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anybody, is that the workplace law was not built for a pandemic. It's at times inflexible. Parliament and the Fair Work Commission, to their credit, have done their best to put some flexibilities in place to help businesses survive through these really difficult periods. But as a lawyer who works for the Australian Business Lawyers, we're owned by the New South Wales Business New South Wales, so we advocate and represent employers. We'd obviously like a little bit more flexibility, but we certainly take what we can get. So I think the overarching principles that I sort of really just want to hammer home here is, first things first, the duty of care to your employees under the relevant work health safety legislations, that's the Work Health Safety Act in New South Wales, remains the same. And you must do all that's reasonably practicable to ensure a safe workplace. Now, in COVID times, if your workplace is allowed to operate, we have a higher threshold now. We're talking masks, we're talking the square metre rule, we're talking social distancing, we're talking all of these sorts of things. The other thing to think about too is we've got the working from home rules. So the rules are essentially, if your employees can work from home, then they should be doing so. I'm lucky enough to be in a role where I can work from home. We obviously know a lot of people can't. And I think it's really important to make sure that, while I understand some people don't love working from home, there's a difference between not wanting to work from home and not being able to work from home. And while I've had debates with certain clients and even within our staff about where the threshold is, and it will be on a case-by-case basis, you will need a better excuse, I imagine, when talking to the police, better than I didn't like working from home. It would need to be, no, I actually couldn't perform my role on a given day, or just on any given day, unless I actually go to my place of work. Obviously, you need to comply with the public health orders. That goes without saying, and they change frequently. I've got a number of links on my last slide, so I'm not going to linger on that. But it's really important to have a look at your modern awards, or if you've got an enterprise agreement in the business, have a look at the enterprise agreement, or your contracts of employment. It's very unlikely that your contract of employment is going to say it's a condition of employment that you must receive the COVID-19 vaccine. The closest thing I've seen is for a aged care provider who was based in Victoria, a client of mine last year. Their contract did say that it was mandatory that they get the flu vaccine. So that's about as close as I can get. Now, whether they've updated their contracts in that time, I don't know, but it's probably not a bad idea in that particular industry. But moving away just from the vaccines, always have a look at what your modern award or enterprise agreement say in respect of flexibilities that you can, or directions that you can give to somebody about what work they can and can't perform, and the contract of employment. Now, a well-drafted contract of employment will have a clause in there that will say something to the effect of, you as an employee or an employee must follow the reasonable and lawful directions of their employer. Now, what is lawful is just a matter of whether it's a direction is a breach of the law or a breach of a legal instrument, like an award or enterprise agreement. What is reasonable, the law loves this term reasonable, is, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. And if it ever gets challenged, you will have to put yourself in the position of, say the Fair Work Commission or someone, that sort of objective third party that will look at a direction and say, well, was that particular direction reasonable? Was it reasonable that an employee who couldn't perform certain duties due to the COVID-19 pandemic was directed to do other duties? Now, when JobKeeper was operating, employers had some very clear rules that they could follow to direct their employees to change hours, change locations, do different duties if they were receiving JobKeeper. Despite some lobbying by Business New South Wales as well, hand in hand with the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I'm sure other employer groups, the government has yet to come to the party, or to come back to the party, I guess, to give that level of flexibility back. To say, well, if you're receiving a COVID-19 disaster payment, for example, your employer has more rights to direct you to do things. So unfortunately, in that respect, it's just going to be a matter of engaging with your staff. It's going to be a matter of you can give reasonable and lawful directions. Management always has a right to give reasonable and lawful directions, but you have to remember to make sure you look at your contracts, look at your enterprise agreements, and for any, there are some very limited exceptions. So for anyone on this call in the restaurant industry covered by the Restaurant Award, you actually do have some flexibilities that were recently passed by the Fair Work Commission. There's a schedule, brand new schedule at the back of the award that will give you a little bit of flexibility. For the rest of the awards, I would double check them. There's certainly a Schedule X at the back of the vast majority of modern awards, which talks about, it gives you certain options like annual leave on half pay and unpaid COVID leave. So there's little bits and pieces, but there's no elegant sort of one fix all solution. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so vaccinations. I reckon everyone on this call would have read articles, seen things on LinkedIn, have that lawyer friend who has an opinion. Everyone has an opinion on this. The one thing I'll say is, without a direction from the government, there is no hard and fast rule here. Now, the minister said before that there was going to be a mandate for health workers. From what I understand, that applies, there'll be a public health order coming out shortly, which will apply to health workers in New South Wales. I've yet to see the details of that. So for example, I think that will mean public sector, so people who are employed by New South Wales Health, but the public health order hasn't come out yet. So I think it's a matter of waiting and seeing. If you're in the private sector health industry, things may not be so clear cut as to whether you can direct, but the general principles are whether, directing vaccinations are, if you've got a specific law, for example, like one that existed in Victoria last year, which mandated a flu vaccine, then it's clearly a lawful direction. In the absence of that, that doesn't make it unlawful, but we need to look at this reasonable concept. And we also need to look if it's permitted by a contract or an enterprise agreement or an award, great. But then you need to think about, would it be lawful and reasonable in a circumstance to direct someone to get the COVID-19 vaccine? And I think my example there is sort of reasonably straightforward in the sense of it is a workplace by workplace and case by case basis. If you came to me as your lawyer and you ran an office environment, so an accounting firm, Ross came to me and said, I want to force all my employees to get vaccinated, we would be having a different discussion as to if someone came to me and said, I run a nursing home, I want to get all my employees vaccinated, because the rhetoric's out there, and I think it's pretty well understood that when we're dealing with vulnerable people in a high-risk environment, it may be more reasonable to direct people to get COVID-19 vaccinations. You will have to deal with things like people with genuine medical exemptions, possible religious exemptions as well. I haven't had one come across my desk yet, but I've certainly had some medical ones, and you'll need to deal with them on a case-by-case basis. Someone just saying, no, I won't get the vaccine without giving you a compelling reason is not good enough on its face. You as the employer can say, well, why? You can ask those questions, but that will be on a case-by-case basis. You can offer incentives for staff to get vaccinated. So incentives could include, gift vouchers. It could include sort of time off work. Just on the incentives, the gift vouchers or a payment, an allowance, there are certain rules around that, so you'll have to check. but the general rule is you've got to offer it. You can offer it to only certain staff, but it has to be retrospective. That basically means that anyone who's fully vaccinated, regardless of when you come up with the scheme, with the incentive, they get it regardless of whether, whether they were vaccinated before or after. Once they get fully vaccinated, here's your gift voucher. But you'll need to check the rules around that one and obviously consult your specialist on that. Next slide, please. Just to be very quick on the COVID-19 disaster payments, because the employees apply for them directly, but there's just some key criteria. So based on amount of hours lost, also it depends on the particular area that you're in. So I don't want to go into sort of too much detail, but Service New South Wales has some really good resources on this. Employees are also eligible for these sort of one-off or smaller payments like a test and isolate payment, which is a one-off. There's also a pandemic leave disaster payment if they qualify for that as well. Now, you as the employer, this isn't directly your responsibility because the employee has to apply for it themselves. However, it's always good to be aware of these payments, because if your employees come to you and say, well, if I'm going to get stood down, for example, if I'm going to get or reduced hours, they might want to know, well, what payments can I get access to? And you want to know which direction you can point them. So the new Service New South Wales website's been quite good on that. Next slide, thank you. So just a few things that you can do right now, and they might seem sort of fairly straightforward, but I think everyone needs to be sort of thinking about these things. So try and engage your staff, encourage and support them to get vaccinated, and do it using government information, and government advice is my best advice. The vast majority of businesses on this call, I'm sure some of you are medical professionals, but a lot of us aren't. And so if the government's providing advice saying get vaccinated, you're absolutely okay to pass on that advice and say, look, the government's telling us that we should encourage you. Please do have that discussion and try and engage with your staff. I've talked about, assisting your employees. You can give them some paid time off. You can give them an incentive, but you'll need to sort of plan for those sorts of things. Make sure that your staff understand the importance of hygiene, wearing masks, the vaccine, social distancing, checking in is really important as well. Keep your accurate records. If you get told by someone that they do have the vaccine, make sure you keep your records accurately. There are privacy issues at play here, so just be careful about how you use that information. You can't compel someone in the vast majority of circumstances to disclose their vaccination status. But if you do get that information, just make sure you're aware of your privacy obligations. And again, as always, we have the duty of care. It's so important under the Workplace Health Safety Act. It could not be more important. It's always your top priority, and it's even more important now. Next slide. These resources I've found to be really, really good, and I hope this sort of helps as sort of a bit of a one-stop shop. We've got the public health order there. We've got the regional and rural restrictions for New South Wales. The COVID safety plans from the New South Wales government website are really good. Safe Work has some excellent resources. The Fair Work Ombudsman has some good resources. Now, Fair Work Ombudsman tends to very much sit on the fence. So if you want some more specific advice to your scenario, Business New South Wales members can always call that the Workplace Advice Line on 132959. They are the best at what they do. And next slide, if anyone is more interested in this vaccination piece, my law firm's running a webinar next Wednesday with a senior barrister, Harry Dixon, and my boss, Lewis Izzo, who's the managing director of my workplace team. And they will be going through all the hairy questions about vaccination. So I think, and it's free, so I think that'll be a really good thing to tune in for. Ross, back to you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. 1 second, apologies. Need to get the presentation back up. So just in terms of concluding that statement, we've got the Q&A now, and I'm mindful obviously of time. We've got 5 minutes there. So I've got a couple of questions that have come in, and I'll defer those to the different speakers around that. First one, I think this would be for you, Travis. We've got a participant on the call here that's so they run more than one business. Are they eligible to receive grants for each of those businesses?
Thanks, Ross. Good question. The answer depends. If you're a sole trader who runs 2 separate businesses under the one ABN, you're only eligible to receive one COVID business grant payment. However, if each of your businesses have separate ABNs, so it might be you run a sole trader or a company, you're eligible to receive payments for both businesses.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that, Travis. This one might be relevant for yourself, Dean, or Benedict. What documentation do we need for our employees who travel to work, who need to travel for work purposes? I understand currently there's no travel permit system in place for New South Wales.
Yeah, good question. I think there is a permit scheme coming in, depending on the areas that you're traveling to, as of, I believe, tomorrow. But again, things are changing very quickly. As far as set doc, it really depends on the industry, to be honest, because it can depend on the documentation you're talking about. For example, in the construction sector in Sydney, certain workers or a lot of workers need to be vaccinated, so they need proof of vaccination before going into a site. So there's that. As far as traveling between different areas, my initial advice, in the absence of a specific piece of paper, would be to double check the public health orders, make sure it's work that's allowed to be done, make sure you've got all the paperwork backing up that you can give to your employees to say, if they're stopped, to say, this is where we're going, this is the business we are, this is the work that we are performing, and all the information in the public health orders say that we are allowed to be doing this. So prepare your employees as best as possible if they are asked any questions. That'd be my advice.
I think, Anthony, you've got something to say on this?
Yeah, some breaking news, Ross. I've received the latest media release just while we've been on this call on permits for travel to regional New South Wales, and so they come into effect from 12:01 tomorrow morning, this is relevant for workers that might be coming to your business from Greater Sydney. So anyone travelling from Greater Sydney to regional New South Wales will require a permit. Relevantly, in terms of workers, anyone from Greater Sydney, including authorised workers from LGAs of concern, who need to travel more than 50 kilometres from Greater Sydney for work purposes, noting the existing requirement for such workers to have had a COVID test in the previous 7 days. So that's probably the relevant part if you've got that scenario, Ross.
Yeah, okay, and I'm really mindful, unfortunately, we're out of time and there are a lot of questions still outstanding. What I would say is that obviously we'll do our best for those questions that haven't been responded to. First port of call, as we've alluded to, is to reach out the information on Business New South Wales website. You can also give New South Wales Service New South Wales a call. Likewise, reach out to your advisor. But what we will do is we'll circulate obviously the content in this webinar, and we will circulate the details of the speakers. So if you do have some specific issues and you need help, then that's great. Please feel free to reach out to them. I just want to,
Ross, I might just one thing that I might add is that it seems that in the Q&A function there's a lot of questions around new businesses, and for those that haven't had the benefit of seeing the response to that, Service New South Wales are taking a manual assessment approach to that scenario. So don't be discouraged if you don't think you fit perfectly within the criteria. We're being told to tell our members, call the business concierge at Service New South Wales, have your relevant documentation ready to establish your position. So that might be a useful one more broadly, Ross.
Thanks for that, Anthony. Okay, so I'd like to thank obviously all our speakers today, Travis from RSM, Anthony from Business New South Wales, and Dean from ABLA. And a special thanks to the Minister for his opening address. As we said, we'll circulate details of the speakers and a recording of the webinar so people can have that for their reference. And we're looking to do something, a follow-up in the next couple of weeks. Obviously, things are changing daily, hourly at the moment. So we'll look to provide further content in the next couple of weeks as things unfold. Just a reminder that obviously it's challenging times, it's confusing, and we, the three organisations, are here to help. And we wish everyone a good weekend and stay safe. So thanks for attending, and see you all soon.